As I walked out on the edge of the street, I saw a guy coming down the street pulling a cart. And it looked like the cart was full of clothes or something. And big, strong, strapping guy, probably 6'4", just very well built, good, clear, intelligent look in his eye. I mean, it's not uncommon to see somebody pulling a basket down the street, but this was uncommon because this guy didn't look like the typical guy that you saw doing that. And he was hollering, "Rags! Rags! I take old rags." I thought, I got to see this. What in the world is going on? So as he passed me by, I thought, I'm going to follow the rag man, but I'm not going to get too close. I'm going to follow at a distance so I can see everything that's going on. And so that's what I did as we started through town. I followed him at a distance, and he'd go down the streets hollering, "Rags! Rags! I take old rags and give you new." We walked a ways, and as we come up on the right-hand side, I could see a woman sitting up on the porch who was crying as we approached. And not just crying, guys. I'm talking about weeping like you and I would weep when that one thing happens in our lives that we shudder to think about happening. That's the way she was weeping. Ragman got to her, and he stopped, and he reached over in his basket, and he pulled out this fresh linen, white, handkerchief-looking thing, and he started making his way up the sidewalk to her house, and he stepped over old tin cans, and he stepped over baby diapers and broken toys, and he got to the lady there on the porch that was just bawling, and he said, "Ma'am, let me take your old rag, and you take my new one." So she feebly gave him her old handkerchief, which was wet and dirty and nasty, and he give her that new handkerchief. And when she took that new handkerchief and wiped her face with it, guys, her tears stopped. Her tears went away. And I'm going to tell you, it looked like not only did her tears go away, it looked like her sadness went away with it. All of a sudden, she didn't look sad like she had looked just moments ago. She looked like she was someone with hope. And so the ragman he turned and walked back to the street, and he got his basket full of clothes, and as he started down the street, he wiped his face with that old rag. And when he did, I want you to know that the ragman just started bawling. Tears just streamed from his eyes. I mean, not just teared up. I mean, I tell you what, he was crying similar to what I saw that woman cry just moments ago. The big man, all of a sudden, his shoulders would slump as he wept and sobbed, clutching that handkerchief, still pulling that basket of clothes. And he went back to hollering, "Rags! Rags! I take old rags. I'll give you new." I followed him on a while, and coming up on the left, we were approaching a park, kind of like this park out here at Success where the kids play. And I could see a group of kids huddled around, like when something's not right. They wasn't playing, running here and there. They were all huddled around, and as I got closer, I could see that they were huddled around this one little girl. And this one little girl had fell, apparently, and hit her head and busted her head open. And the other kids, in a panic to try to help her, they had taken some makeshift bandages, and they had bandaged the little girl's head up, but it was bleeding, and there was a trickle of blood coming out from under the bandage on the little girl's face and down her cheek. And she had a look in her eye of not only of hurt, but of fear, and not knowing what was going to happen, a fear of "where's my mama" type look in her eye. And so the ragman pulled his basket up to her, and he reached in it and he pulled out this new yellow bonnet, a new hat like some of you ladies are wearing this morning. And he walked to her and he said, "Baby, let me have your bandage and I'll give you my hat." And she just kind of nodded sheepishly, not knowing really what was going on, but too scared to say anything else, too much pain to even care at that point. And so the ragman, he took the bandage off the little girl's head, and he put the yellow hat, yellow bonnet on the little girl. And guys, I was shocked to see that the little girl stopped bleeding. Not only did she stop bleeding, the little girl got up and went back to playing as if nothing had ever happened. She went to running around wanting everybody else to look at her new yellow hat that she had been given. The ragman turned around, and as he got back to his basket, he slipped the bandage on his head. And I had to take a step back, guys, because blood run from underneath the bandage down his cheek. Not her blood, his blood. And now the ragman got back to the street, and he's got the bandage on, and he's bleeding now from the head, and he's still clutching the handkerchief, and he's crying. And he's not the same man I had saw hours earlier that morning who passed my apartment. The ragman walked determined, but he was weaker. He was not the same man. But he still pressed on, and he was still hollering, "Rags! Rags! I take old rags and give you new." By this point, I didn't know what was going on, but I wanted to see it to the end. So I kept following the ragman, and as we got down into the industrial park there where the factories and stuff are, he came on an old guy that was leaning up against the wall. He was leaning up against the wall, kind of like this. And the ragman said, "Sir, how about a new set of clothes for your work?" And the old boy just hardly acknowledged him. Kind of shrugged his shoulders. But the ragman persisted. He said, "Sir, how about a new set of clothes for you to go to work in?" And the old boy raised up, and you could see when he raised up, he just had one arm. The shoulder he was leaning against the wall with was a shoulder with just a nub on it. He said, "Sir, I'd love to be able to go to work, but I just have this one arm." The ragman said, "Change coats with me. Take my jacket. I'll take yours." The gentleman said, "Well, if that's what makes you happy." He slipped the old army coat off of his shoulder and down his one good arm, and he handed it to the ragman. And then what happened next, guys, made me sick at my stomach. When the ragman took his coat off, his right arm stayed in the sleeve. When he took his coat off, the ragman had nothing but a bloody nub, and his arm stayed in the sleeve of that jacket. And that man took that coat and he slipped it on his one good arm, and then he put his little nub in there. And when he stretched his arms out, he stretched out two arms, completely whole and healed and functioning and ready to go to work. The ragman said, "Now, go to work." He said, "Sir, thank you. I'll go with pleasure." So now the ragman turned around, and he's still clutching the handkerchief. He's crying, and the blood is flowing from under the bandage on his head. And he gets the basket, and he can see he's in some pain now. And so now he's still going down the street hollering, "Rags, rags, I take old rags, I give you new." But now he's weak. He's much weaker. And the head injury is obvious. And he's doing the best he can with the one arm that he does have. As we got close to the edge of town, you know how the overpasses are. We walked under an overpass, and there lay a drunk on the sidewalk there, passed out. But more than just drunk, this man was sick. You could tell by looking, his color was bad. He was so weak, so frail. The ragman stopped and never said a word to him, never tried to wake him up or anything. He reached in his basket, pulled out a new white linen, folded up. He walked over to the old man that was passed out, and he took his cloth off of him. And I tell you, the stench, guys, I can't describe what that smelled like, but it didn't faze the ragman. It didn't faze him. It was as if he didn't even notice. He pulled that old cloth off of that man, and he laid that new cloth on that old drunk that was passed out there. And let me tell you what happened next. The old drunk raised up. And then he sat up. And then he got up. Not like he was. His color was back. His eyes were clear. He folded up the cloth that the ragman had just covered him up with, and he went off down the street with a spring in his step that chances are he hadn't had in years and years and years. Now the ragman, when he got back to his basket, he threw the cloth, threw the blanket over his shoulders that the old man was covered up in. And still crying and sobbing and bleeding from the head and pulling that cart with one hand. But now the ragman would stumble and fall every few feet as if he was drunk, and certainly looked very, very sick. Nothing like the man I had saw that morning when I walked out of my house and he came by. But he pressed on. He kept pressing on. At this point, I can't look away, but I can't take my eyes off of him. At this point, I'm having every emotion under the sun. I just want to see where this is going to end. I have never witnessed anything like this. So I kept following the ragman at a distance, and he turned into an old landfill. Trash piled high, and just junk cars sitting everywhere. And I found an old junk car, and I just leaned up against the side of it as I watched the ragman drag that cart across that landfill. And he started up one of those big trash piles. And he'd stumble, and he would fall. And with just that one arm dragging that cart. But he worked, and he worked, and he finally got to the top of one of those landfills, a big piles of trash. And he got in his basket, and he laid a cloth out, and he laid down on it. And he took the old army jacket, and he took the handkerchief, and he made a pillow out of them, and he laid his head on it. And he took the old blanket that he got from the drum, and he covered himself up with it. And then the ragman died. I'm not going to lie to you guys, I was heartbroken. I had come to feel like I knew this guy just in this day's time that I had followed him. I was heartbroken. I just turned around and sat down in one of those old junk cars. I was physically, I was mentally, I was emotionally exhausted, guys, from the day I had just had following this ragman around, not even knowing what he was doing. Why had I not intervened? What could I have even done? Why would he do these things? Just none of it made sense, and I was just a wreck. And I just leaned my head back in one of that old car, exhausted, and just passed out into sleep. Apparently I slept all Friday night through Saturday, but it must have been early on Sunday morning. Something like an earthquake woke me up, shaking that old car. And I raised up to see this bright light shining from out on the landfill in through the window, so bright I couldn't even fix my eyes on it. I had to blink and try to shade my eyes. But when I could see what it was the ragman. It was the ragman. He was up. And he was not only up, guys, he was whole. He was as I had saw him that Friday morning just 3 days prior. He was completely whole with 2 strong arms and a strong physical body and a clear look in his eye. And he was folding up those old rags that he had gathered up, and they were no longer old rags. They were clean. And they were all new. It was at that point, guys, where I knew what I had just witnessed on that Friday, and what had transpired to that Sunday was no mere man. I was in the presence of something much, much greater. And my thought at that time is, I'm not worthy to be in the presence of this man who was much more than a man. But I knew I needed what he had. And so I humbly, with my head down, I humbly approached the ragman as he stood there in all his glory, just unbelievable, whole and complete and strong. And I just bowed low before the ragman, and I said, "Ragman, I'm unworthy to be in the presence of you, but I know I need what you have." And I began to take off those old dirty clothes that I had had on since Friday. And I said, Ragman, would you clothe me? And the Ragman said, son, I would love nothing more than to do just that. And that day the Ragman clothed me in clothes of righteousness that never stain, that never fade, that can never die. The Ragman, my Ragman, the Savior, my Savior,